Namaste and welcome to the Festival of Bharat. My name is Divyanshi Sharda, your host. Our special guest for today's show is Sri Raj Vedam ji. Dr. Raj Vedam works at the confluence of applied mathematics, engineering, algorithms, and computer science. Using the tools of archaeogenetics, archaeoastronomy, and archaeology, and the evidence of knowledge transfers from ancient India, the speaker has put forward a strong thesis with verifiable facts on the antiquity of Indian civilization and the many discoveries made by the ancients. Dr. Raj Vedam is a co-founder of the think tank Indian History Awareness and Research, and he's also the visiting faculty at the Hindu University of America. Dr. Vedam ji, namaste and welcome to our show.
Namaste. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be on the show.
The pleasure is all ours. So we're truly honored to have you here with us.
Thank you.
So, sir, in your talks, you have extensively spoken about the five inimical frameworks that control the narratives of Indian history. So, could you please tell us about what they are?
Yes. Thank you for that excellent question, Divyanshi. So this relates to the historiography of the Indian civilization. When we talk about who are the people who wrote the history of India, for the longest time, we see that Indians have been happy with the notion of history that we have, which means, for example, the Puranas, the Itihasas, Sthala Puranas, or genealogies that are maintained by various groups of people across the country. Or we go to a temple and we read the epigraphy that says this temple was done by this king in this time, and so on and so forth. Or the folklore and stories we have. This has been our notion of history at the family level, at the unit level, civilization level for the longest time. So the question comes when we read the history of India today in our NCERT books and so on, who are the people who wrote this? This is the historiography. And in my work, I found that there are five frameworks that have been applied on the narration of Indian history, in which it's an entirely outsider lens. It's not an insider lens. That is why I tend to call them inimical frameworks. These are not frameworks that are looking at the Indian civilization in what it really is, but trying to amplify certain ideologies that they have. So these frameworks are things, for example, when the colonial people came to India. So they came, the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, the British, all these people came to India, and once the East India Company started its activities, they wanted to know what is the history of these people that we are trying to trade or rule and these kinds of things. So they started a certain kind of narration of Indian history driven by their requirements and needs, which was, we need to rule India. In order to rule India, there is a necessity to make the Indians feel small about their civilization and look up to the British civilization as a big, huge, powerful country with lots of things to teach the Indians. So it came with a lens that looked at Indians as primitive, backward, superstitious, and these kinds of things. They were soon followed by the Eurocentric framework. And why did the Eurocentric framework come? Because the colonialists, for example, people like William Jones and others who were also linguists, they observed that, hey, it looks like Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek are related. And how is that possible? So that triggered off one more line of thinking to try and show why are these languages related. And it brought about the field of linguistics to try and address some of these concerns. So when the Eurocentric people came on the scene, they were concerned with what is the relationship between us, white Europeans, and these Indians? Why do we speak the same language? And therein was born the Eurocentric lens, because it led to some concepts in linguistics. It led to some postulations and assumptions and constructions of some models. And these models were strongly Eurocentric because of the kind of pressures on them, things like German Aryanism, things like various other things that are acting upon some of these things. They were soon followed by the missionaries. The missionaries were never far behind colonialism. So wherever colonialism was there was also missionary activity happening. So they came with a certain lens. They wanted to convert the Indians to Christianity. So they put their own ideologies on the narrations of Indian history. After our independence, we have unfortunately experienced Nehruvian socialism, the Fabian socialism, that has brought about its own lenses. So the kind of failed theories like certain kinds of anthropological studies like cranial metrics and other kinds of things that are applied to early studies like in 1900s, Risley and others, that has led to present day sociological models. It's an evolution from there to sociological models where the outsider lens is applied to all of Indian dynamics. Every one of Indian dynamics is seen in the lens of subaltern studies or post-colonial or feminism and these kinds of divisive models that tend to look at conflict, the conflict model, oppressor-oppressed. So they bring in that kind of a lens. And since 1972, at least, India has unfortunately experienced the communist model in addition, that framework. So the Marxists control the education framework today in India, and they have brought their bigoted lens to the narration of Indian history, where everything is seen in the conflict model. So these five frameworks, Divyanshi, the colonial model, the Eurocentric model, the missionary model, the leftist socialist model, and the Marxist model. These five frameworks have brought their ideologies and they have subverted the narration of Indian history to their own ideologies. This is what we are seeing today. There's a subversion of identity, there's a subversion of history, all to suit the narrations of these five frameworks. That, unfortunately, is continuing to the present day. So this is what I meant when I say these are the five inimical frameworks that control the narration of Indian history today, whether you're seeing it in NCERT textbooks, whether you're experiencing it in popular media, in movies and television channels and narrations. These are the five frameworks. If you study what they're saying deeply, you can docket them into one of these frameworks and say, these people belong to this persuasion. This is the ideology that is being pushed. And this is what we see.
Very rightly said, sir. So we can deduce that almost right, like you rightly said, that all the so-called quote unquote education that we are given about Indian history does come under one of these five categories. And one of the major topics that sets off a very controversial debate in our country is the Indo-Aryan migration theory, which again is a very contentious issue that can be grouped under one of these five categories.
Right.
So, why, in your opinion, was the Indo-Aryan migration theory started, and in what ways has it distorted our current understanding of Indian history?
Excellent question. So I noticed that you use the word migration, which historically in historiography did not begin as a migration, it began as an invasion. So let us look into why that happened. Again, it is related to this frameworks that I talked about earlier, these five frameworks that I said, it is related to that. So when William Jones saw commonality of languages, they started proposing, why are Latin, Sanskrit, Greek, and the European languages related? So they went through a study of that using the field that has come to be called linguistics today. So the way they studied this was to try and see how do words change from one language into another. For example, if you take a word list comprised of, let's say, 100 common words that people used in a rural setting, pastoral setting, or ancient setting, words like, run, walk, eat, all those kind of words. Now you see how these basket of words changes from one language to the other, and you have some notion of distance and how words morph. So the field of linguistics came about with the invention of several things called sound laws. How does one sound change from one to the other? What is a more ancient form of a sound? What is a more recent form of a sound? And things of that nature. For example, in Maharashtra, the va becomes ba in Bengali. So you see a word is morphed from one to the other. Even in India, we see that. So observations of these things led people to propose how words change. Field of linguistics came, like I said, with lots of sound laws. And each time they found a proposal was made, and this is how sound might have traveled, this is how the words might have traveled. And every time a counterexample was found, a new band-aid was put. The band-aid was one more sound law that covers that counterexample. So things of this nature were done in the field called comparative method. In comparative linguistics method, they started doing these things, the Swadesh list, and coming about with the so-called relationship between languages. This also led to the study of could there have been an ancestral language, which is what they call as a Proto-Indo-European ancestral language, from whom has derived all of these languages that we see today. So such a reconstruction took place among the colonialists and the colonial linguists, at least. And one thing they soon faced was, where is the data to form such a model? There is no archaeology, there is no epigraphy, there is no script, there is no evidence anybody anywhere spoke this PIE language. So it was academically reconstructed hypothetical language. So to reconstruct that, they took the data, for example, from Sanskrit. Sanskrit provided the bulk of the data, from which they worked backwards and proposed that perhaps there is an Indo-Iranian language which gave rise, a Proto-Indo-Iranian language that gave rise to some Sanskrit word. And going backwards from Proto-Indo-Iranian, they proposed there is a Proto-Indo-European ancestral language. So this way, they started using Sanskrit as the mechanism to get the data, work backwards, and try to propose this huge tree of how languages have evolved, which is the current model even to the present time. And what also happened initially, they thought when people started saying there's a Proto-Indo-European language, people asked, where is the homeland for this language? So the homeland became another big debate in the Eurocentric circles. And the homeland changed all over the place, starting from maybe places like Germany, places like Syria, places like Caucasus Mountains, places like Central Asia, places like India. All these were supposed to be homeland languages. Initially, they thought India is a homeland. They thought Sanskrit is the ancestor of all languages. Then around 1880s or so, they discovered the Mitannis and the Hittites, the evidence of that civilization in northern Iraq, southern Turkey, in that locality. And there was evidence that these people spoke perhaps Sanskrit, because they had Sanskritic kind of names and they were invoking Vedic deities in their peace treaties with the pharaohs, Egyptian pharaohs, and so on. So the question came, how is it that these people are here and what is the time frame for them being there? And this whole debate of Indian homeland shifted and it went all over the place. And they said Central Asia. Central Asia, centrally located, it is equally distant to the Scandinavian countries and to India on this side. So perhaps statistically, that is the place where the homeland must have been. And modern day people like Maria Gimbutas, Colin Renfrew and others were proposing certain ideas. But I think I'm jumping the gun. I need to go even more back. So the Eurocentric claims on the homeland led to certain ideas of migration of people because of the domestication of horse and iron technology and such things. So that required Indians to, the Aryans rather, the so-called Aryans, to have invaded India by 1500 BCE, according to the linguistic models and what they were trying to come up with. So AIT was born out of these unique requirements of trying to explain the behavior of languages, why the languages are all related, and the invention of rules of linguistics by the Eurocentric people, and the invention of a homeland for these people in Central Asia, and the trying to fit archaeological models for this, whether it is in the corded ware people on the European side, or whether it is in BMAC culture, or whether it is in India, trying to fit the archaeological record. So all these led to this Aryan invasion theory. This invasion theory was proposed initially by 1920s or so, going all the way to around 1950s, 1960s, and under tremendous challenge later on when people said that there's no evidence of any of these things. And the minute they said there's no evidence of invasion, this whole thing became a migration theory. Perhaps it is not an invasion, it is a migration, and they might have come as a migration route. So in historiography, we see started out with invasion. It started out with the need to explain languages. It started out with the need to find an identity for the European people in relation to the Indians. And it transformed into the entity that we see today, and the narrative that we see today in Aryan invasion / migration theory.
So that's really fascinating to know, sir, that this initially started out as a study or as a postulation on the similarity of languages, and first was an invasion, then transformed into a migration. So, my question to you is something that a lot of viewers might be having in their minds related to this, is that was this particular speculation on the similarity of languages in fact factually accurate, or are there evidences, solid evidences, that counter this theory, especially on the basis of the research that you have conducted?
Excellent, excellent. So yes, there have been a lot of people over time when such theories were proposed to try to see is there evidence for such a narration at all. So as far as linguistics is concerned, several people have noted several things. Going back to colonial times itself, there was a gentleman called Parjita. Parjita did a study of several of the Indian texts and so on. And he said, look, as far as the Rig Veda is concerned, it appears that there are several, it is not in order. The mandalas 1 to 10 are not in chronological order. Some are ancient, some are more recent. So he said, if you look at the chronology of the books of the Rig Veda, the earliest mandalas are talking about the geography of the eastern side of the Saraswati. And the later books are talking about the geography to the western side. He also noted that, hey, there's no evidence of holy sites, sacred sites in northwest part of India, but the eastern part of India, Varanasi, Banaras, all these have got great cultural significance in India. So he proposed at that time, in contrary to his countrymen, that it appears to be an east to west migration and not a west to east migration. And the same kind of theories have been studied in much greater detail by Srikant Talagiri in our own times, where he's also noted the antiquity of the various books of the Rig Veda, in other words, the chronology, related to chronology, saying that some books are later, some are earlier. He echoes the same observation of Parjita, saying that these earlier books are talking about these rivers to the east over here, and the later books are talking to the rivers to the west. So if people had come from the northwest, they'd have encountered rivers in this order, but instead we are seeing a mention of rivers in this order. He's also talking about the relative antiquity of the chronology of the Persian people and the Indian people. He's talking about how the later books are talking about the Persians, are talking about the wheel and other such things, which again give the idea that it is an east to west migration. Srikant Talagiri is also studying the chronology of the word list. For example, the names of the kings in Mitanni kings, and so on. He's showing that even the names have got they were in fashion in a certain time frame. And by looking at the chronology of the time frame when certain names were in fashion and certain names fell out of fashion, he's countering some of the popular theories. According to Srikant Talagiri, he's saying if the homeland is in northwest India, everything is okay. He's okay with the linguistic model that out of India fits the data fairly well. He's got some criticisms here and there, but it fits fairly well. But it cannot be a Central Asia model. This is a central thesis. One more person, Nicholas Kazanas, he has come about saying that he's looked at the stories in the Eastern tradition, in the European tradition and the Indian tradition, comparing the stories and trying to see if he can get hints over here. He's come with a thesis saying, if there is a Proto-Indo-European language, it is so ancient that there is absolutely no way you can reconstruct it. He's saying you cannot have data from any of the present day languages to reconstruct this PIE because it is simply so ancient. So he's calling all of the works that use PIE as utter rubbish. So that is a very, very strong conclusion from Kazanas. So looking at the linguistics model, we can know that, hey, there are some problems over here. From linguistics, we can look at archaeology. In archaeology, has been proposed for invasion theory. If you look at how Harappa was discovered, who were the first people who worked at Harappa, it turns out to be Marshall. Marshall, when he proposed the theories at Harappa, at Mohenjo-daro, he said that there is evidence of habitation that starts somewhere around 3000, maybe 500 BCE. And he felt that the Harappan phase, Mohenjo-daro phase, ended by 2700 BCE or thereabouts, which is 1000 years before the alleged Aryans had come into India. So it turns out that after him, one more British archaeologist called Mortimer Wheeler, he came on the scene, and he's the one who advanced the date. He made the date from 2700 BCE, brought it down to 1500 BCE. He said that the Harappan culture existed from 3500 BCE to 1500 BCE in order to allow for the Aryan invasion theory to have come. That was a time when expedient readings of Rig Veda were also made. They were trying to find translations where they found snub-nosed dasas and other people who were conquered by Indra and his invading armies, Purandara, destroyer of forts. So it was Indra who came and destroyed all these settlements of Harappans, and this is the proof that Aryans had come into India. They started doing these things. That was followed by embellishment. More people came and embellished this whole thing by saying, yes, there is evidence of skeletons who had died over here. You see in the invasion, and the cities have been burned. Kosambi, for example, the father of Marxist historiography in India, Kosambi, who comes and says that evidence of destruction by primitive culture has destroyed a far superior culture that existed, and the conflict model coming in over here. All of this was rebutted from those times itself. For example, P.V. Kane, who came and said that there is no evidence of any such destruction, including others who came and said that the skeletons in question were found in different strata. It is not a point event around 1500 BC, but in different places, different strata. That is the first evidence. Some other researchers, Dale and others, came and said that, hey, there is no evidence of widespread fire. There is no evidence of destruction. There's no evidence of any such thing. Bone specialists like Kenneth Kennedy came there and said, some of the skeletons they are saying show signs of healing. Even if they had injuries, they show signs of healing, which means they did not die in that event. It was some injury that had healed later on. So all these things showed that there's no such thing as invasion, which is why the story became one of migration. So we looked at linguistics and we looked at archaeology. And there's a whole lot of other things to talk about too when you talk about evidence for this, for this whole thing. For example, genetics. Today, a whole lot of people are talking about genetics. Genetics is something that's been kicked around by so many people because the field is so complex that many people have no clue what is being proposed by these premier schools, Harvard Medical School and others. And pedigree is promoted over factual evidence of what is going on. If somebody from Harvard comes and says, this is what the paper is all about, and that is it. The news media and everybody goes gaga over this and they report their results without the diligence to see, does it make sense? Does it make sense in light of other things that we have? So I have talked extensively about genetics and methodology and how to critique it in my talks. I'm not going to repeat that over here. So in addition to that, one big outlier is Saraswati River. So the Saraswati River is talked about in Rig Veda as having been a huge flowing river all the way from Himalayas to the ocean. And if the Aryans came in 1500 BCE, saw the Saraswati and wrote it, there's a big problem here. There's a big problem here because our hydrology models are saying that this river probably dried out by 1900 BC because of tectonic movements and other such things. There's a paper that came out about 2 years back or so, I think from one of the IITs, that looked at the mineralogy and the hydrology of these rivers. And they said the Saraswati River seems to show two perennial phases. Perennial means flowing throughout the year. And the first phase was somewhere around 80,000 years ago. And the second phase was about 9,000 years ago up to 4,000 years ago, which means it was a flowing river from 9,000 to 4,000 years ago. And after that, it was dried. So the question is, how did the so-called Aryans who invaded or migrated to India in 1500 BC have seen a non-existent river and spoken pains and other such things about this mighty river? That's not possible. So River Saraswati stands out as a huge counterexample. Of course, the invasionists and the migrationists have got a story for this. The story is, one, as in NCRT, this river is mythical. NCRT does not even talk about Saraswati by name. You can go to the 12th grade book, 10th grade book, 11th grade and search where are they talking about River Saraswati. They dare not mention it. They dare not mention it. There's no mention of Saraswati River anywhere in any of these books. And if at all, It has come in the context of saying Saraswati is a mythical river, one. Second, on their migration route to India via Afghanistan, they saw some of the river Haraswati and they mistook that for, and they named that Saraswati. So these are the kind of bigoted narratives that have come and layered over wherever evidence is found. The internal evidence is coming and saying, hey, we have a problem over here. They've come and layered it with one more layer of lies, if you will. So internal evidence. So if we talked about linguistics, we talked about archaeology, we talked about hydrology, we talked about genetics, then there's also the internal evidence. All of the Indian texts are showing great antiquity. We'll talk about this later, but talking about great antiquity. So do we stand in a point where we say Indian texts are irrelevant to the discussion? This is a trend that has been set by Max Muller and others. When they were critiqued on their models, they positioned all of the Indian texts as unreliable and not relevant. That is a thinking that has percolated all the way to the present times, where even though we have got a rich body of collection of texts to give historical data, we intentionally push that away, saying we are secular people. We will not see our own history of our people that they're taught in their texts and their works. Although they exist, the rishis exist, or rather, the works exist, the rishis wrote, but we will not even talk about these authors. We will not even talk about any of these works. This is one of the horrendously paradoxical situations that we are in today, where we discount the works of our own intellectuals of the past. Their works exist. They can give us enormous data and evidence to counter this Aryan invasion theory model, but we don't use it. Finally, I will stop with the observations of B.B. Lal. B.B. Lal has been one of the most well-known archaeologists in India for a long time. And initially, he worked with Wheeler. He was an apprentice under Wheeler, and he worked on Harappa archaeology and so on. And initially, he said that, look, looking at the painted graveware and all that pottery, there is no evidence that there is a war at Kurukshetra, and the pottery record only goes back to a certain phase in time. He was a darling of the Marxists when he initially said these things. But after a long career, he came out, changed his stance, and said that, look, there is no periodization in Indian history. If you're trying to say there is a Harappa period followed by a so-called Vedic period, that is bogus, he said, because there is every evidence that these are completely intertwined. He did not see a separation. He saw continuity of the Indian civilization. He proposed several concepts like cultural continuity, things like the Namaste pose, which is found in terracotta figurines in Harappa. He's talking about some of the games, some of the agriculture. So many things can be observed where we have a continuity of civilization from the so-called Harappa times through the so-called Vedic times, which calls into question the periodization and everything. So, Divyanshi, there is a lot of evidence from various fields. It'll take a long time to go over each of them in detail. So I apologize that I've just rushed through some of these things. Hopefully it's coherent, what I said.
Of course it is. So you don't need to worry about that at all. I mean, the kind of knowledge that people get from listening to you is so inestimable. It's beyond measure. So
Oh, thank you.
thank you so much for so beautifully encapsulating whatever you have researched and whatever the evidences are. Because you are so right when you say that we are not told these things in school. Because I mean, I'm graduating from school this year itself,
Mhm,
and I have not been told a single of the things that you have mentioned.
oh,
And
goodness.
I was so shocked to find, because till 1 or 2 years ago, I had no clue about all of this. So when I started reading, you were the first people I started following on social media to read up about how the Indo-Aryan migration theory is so suspicious, etc. So that's when my mind started opening, that whatever we have been told, everything's a lie. And for a student, the realization that dawns upon the person is so magnanimous. It's so heavy and massive, that makes you question everything you studied so far. So like you said, that how they have completely mythologized every single evidence they can't disprove. So
Right,
Saraswati River, they just said it's mythical because they can't disprove that it wasn't true. I mean, so they're in their own world. They have concocted a new history for us
right,
to believe
right,
in.
right.
Very true. So, sir, my next question to you is this, that you mentioned about how relations to the antiquity of the Indian civilization and the antiquity of the Hindu Sanskrit texts, we can also substantiate as to how these five models of Indian history that we are taught are actually quite flawed. So,
Mhm,
what can we in the 21st century
mhm.
understand with regards to the antiquity of the Indian civilization?
Very good question. But before I answer that, Divyanshi, in relation to the comments you made towards the end of the last question, so I'd like to say, first of all, our pronouns to all the teachers who have taught us. So it is not my work. I am building on the work of so many gurus, acharyas, teachers who have done their work and provided it. And some of them are no more, people like P.V. Kane, people, so many others who have done enormous works and given these things, including some of the works I quoted today, were from people like Professor Michel Danino, like Conrad Els, like Rajiv Malhotra. Many, many intellectuals have enriched us today with their scholarship. And I think it is our duty and the duty of your generation to read the works of these teachers, these acharyas, these gurus, so that we are able to take our narrative out of this and propagate that. Okay, having said that, so let me, that's my citation, by the way. Having said that, so let me go to antiquity. Your question was on antiquity. Yes, we do see evidence of antiquity of the Indian civilization. Now, civilization is a much disputed word. Civilization has been defined conveniently by different people. For example, the ancient Greeks, they thought anybody who doesn't speak Greek is uncivilized. So that was their notion of civilization. So various people had their notion of civilization. And right now, academia has got a self-serving definition where it says that there needs to be evidence of writing. If there is evidence of writing, that's where history starts from that point on. And if there's writing, then you're communicating your ideas. There is diversification of occupations, and there is a society that can support these diversified occupations and growth of technology and other such things. That is civilization. So they have but then I say that by doing that, we're doing a great disservice to our own civilization, which for the longest time had an authentic oral tradition. Why would you discount the oral tradition in favor of a written tradition only? By doing that, you are falling into that framework where you say Indian works are unreliable because they're oral tradition. That is completely to be avoided. So I tend to look at this as a deep history. I don't call it prehistory in history. I call this the deep history of the Indian civilization. And there is a lot of evidence we have for that. And I'll just call out two of them. I'll start out with archaeology. In archaeology, we see, whether it's paleontology or archaeology, we are seeing evidence of human occupation of India for this land that we are calling India today for the longest time. Whether you go back to 1 million years ago when the Homo erectus supposedly had occupied India, from that time on, going through the finds at Athirampakam by Shanti Papu and other researchers in 350,000 years ago, when they found stone tools in Tamil Nadu and other such places, or coming even further down to the so-called Narmada man, where the skull is found in Narmada Valley, that supposedly has a cranial capacity of a modern human in an era when Homo sapiens shouldn't have been there. We are seeing such kind of artifacts all the way down, going down to the works of Ravi Korisetter, who's saying that before the Mount Toba event in 70,000 years before present, there's evidence of human habitation in Jwalapuram. And after the Mount Toba event, which is a super volcano, by the way, in Sumatra, after that, also, we are finding evidence of human habitation, which shows continuous habitation for a long time. From there, you go to archaeological records showing cave drawings and other such things from Bhimbetka, other places 40,000 years ago. We are seeing artifacts all over India. We're seeing artifacts. Recently, in the Deccan area in Maharashtra, they found petroglyphs and others that is again pointing to an ancient period of time. Go to underwater archaeology. If you go to Dwarka, we are seeing 9,000 years before present, they have found evidence of artifacts over there. If you look at the work of National Institute of Oceanography in Chennai, Kanholi and others, they published a paper on this, on episodes. Or if you go to last year, there was a paper published by Professor Ramaswamy from a university in Tamil Nadu that is talking about Pumpuhar. He's saying how using sonar and underwater remotely operated vehicles, he has been able to find underwater artificial structures 25 kilometers out into the sea, which is off the west coast of India, east coast of India, where there is Pumpuhar. And they found about 120 meters below the sea level, they found human artifacts, which goes to show at the time of the late glacial maximum, 18,000 years ago, when water was locked up in ice, sea level was much lower throughout the world. At that time, there were humans living in that place. He's also found evidence of harbor and artificial structures over there, which is now a head scratcher, which means 15,000 years ago in Tamil Nadu, we are finding that there is evidence of people who are using perhaps a maritime commerce culture 15,000 years ago and going all over perhaps to Dwarka by 9,000 years ago. This completely rewrites anything in our history, if you will, civilization, if you will, commerce, if you will, trading and other such things. We are seeing deeper and deeper antiquity in some of the finds. So going on from this, we go to Birana, Rakigadi, we are seeing around 9,000 years before present. We are seeing finding artifacts all the way through the Harappa time frame, southern India, seeing Kiradi and other such places, Harikemeda and megalith structures and many, many such things. So all over the India, archaeology and paleontology is showing great antiquity. Now the internal evidence of our texts are also showing great antiquity. For example, archaeoastronomy. We have an ancient text called Vedanga Jyotisha. Vedanga Jyotisha, now several people try to date how old is this text. And one of the colonialists, Colebrook came out with the date of 1400 BCE for this, which turns out to be around that correct time. If we use planetarium software, we can find out Dhanishta Nakshatra, the winter solstice, which is mentioned in this work, or inferred in this work, and we can say this. If you look at Shatapatha Brahmanas, a work that was written by Rishi Yajnavalkya, that is talking about how the Kritika Nakshatra does not swerve from the east direction. And if you try to go back in the planetarium software and try to see when was the Kritika Nakshatra at the equinox position of the celestial equator for a heliacal rising along with the sun, we find that date must go to 2982 BCE. Are you with me? 2982 BC for Shatapatha Brahmana, Rishi Yajnavalkya, some of the earliest works have to go back if this observation of Kritika Nakshatra is to be taken. If you look at the various places in India where we are talking about a calendar event, what is this calendar event? Whether it is epigraphy in southern India, whether it is several texts in northern India, whether it is the daily prayers of many Hindus even today, everybody is talking about their time with respect to a certain event, including Aryabhatta, with a certain event. And that certain event turns out to be a planet clustering in the Revati Nakshatra, where all planets, sun, moon had clustered over there. It goes back to 3102 BCE. This is the so-called Kali Yuga event. Kali Yuga started in this time frame. People will throw this away saying, it's all just bogus. But the point is, this is something that is widespread not only in Indian astronomical calendars, also in the astronomical calendars of Thailand. It was Siam at that time. Siam tables are with respect to this. Several places all over the world, we see this kind of thing. So 3102 BCE. If you go even further behind that, if you go to, for example, there is a story of Aditi. there is a story of Aditi and the Punarvashu Nakshatra, which Lokmanya Tilak as well as Professor Abhyankar, they had decoded that in astronomy, and we can date that to 6000 BCE. There is a story of Ashwinis, Surya, Sanjana, and Chaya. Everybody knows the story about this. And this story can be tracked back to 7200 BCE, according to Tilak, as well as according to Professor Abhyankar. And these are in the Rig Veda. Now, going back even further, recently, Professor Anil Narayanan, he had written a book on Indian astronomy, and he's saying in Surya Siddhanta, there is a position of the Swati Nakshatra. Swati is the star which we call Arcturus today. The position of Swati is such that all stars in the sky have got something called proper motion. So we are all going on the galactic center, right? So it takes 230 million years for our solar system to go once around the Milky Way galaxy. So in doing so, several other stars may have quicker motion than us, at least related to our observation. And Swati has got a proper motion, which is one of the fastest in the sky. So by studying the rate of Swati's proper motion, we can work backwards in time, and we can say that the observation of Swati goes to 8000 BCE. There is a story of Agastya in our text, how Agastya drank up the ocean and how he gives up the ocean finally also. This can be related to the late glacial maximum. In addition to the appearance of the Canopus star. Canopus star is the one we call Agastya in the Indian tradition. The appearance of that in the southern horizon because of precision. And that can be dated approximately 10,000 BCE. So we are seeing internal evidence, whether you look at archaeology or whether you look at archaeoastronomy, we are seeing great antiquity. And we can correlate that with climatology, genetics, and other things. And we can see great antiquity for the Indian civilization.
My goodness, sir. I mean, this is too much for me to absorb. Thank you. I can't thank you enough I'll keep saying this. Please don't mind me saying this, because the kind of knowledge that I'm receiving is so priceless that it's really transforming the way I have looked at Indian history, because even I didn't know there is such massive astronomical evidence for
Mhm.
our antiquity. I wasn't really, I mean, I had heard of it, but I wasn't really so well acquainted with it that it's dating back to 10,000, 9,000 BC, and that was really something that's illuminating. So, coming to my next question, because of course we have to wrap up the interview also. But don't worry, so you can take your time and answer. The time is really not a constraint. I
Okay.
just said that as a disclaimer. So if I were to ask you a question relating to the knowledge systems that we had in ancient
Right.
India,
Right.
what were the different kinds of indigenous Indic epistemology that we can probably come to acquaint ourselves with?
Right. So you're right to first go, when we talk about knowledge systems, we have to show there's a tradition of knowledge systems in India, and what are those knowledge systems, and what are the methodologies for knowledge and epistemology. So if we look at some of the traditional accounts, it says that all knowledge comes from the Shruti and the Smriti traditions. The Shruti includes things like the Vedas, we know that, the Brahmanas, the Upanishads, the Aranyakas. All of these things are the Shruti tradition, and there is a deep philosophical knowledge and epistemology in all of these things. On the other side, if you go to the Smriti tradition, there also we are seeing enormous bodies of knowledge. We are seeing things like, for example, the Puranas, the Itihasas, the Kavyas, the Nibandhas. We're seeing the Vedangas, the six Vedangas. So many items of knowledge in India are lumped over here. It is such that anybody who wanted to find intellectual fulfillment could easily do so within the framework of knowledge systems that existed in India. There was no conflict between philosophy and knowledge systems, as opposed to the today's Western world, where the minute we talk about science, it is at conflict with the dominant religion, Abrahamic religions, because there is a creation model pushed over there, and here there's a different kind of model pushed over here in science. So we find that their systems do not reconcile. But in the Indian tradition, there is no such dichotomy. It's always studied intertwined. It is part of the basis of looking at the world. And the way you look at the world is what we call pramanas and other things. So we had the Shad Darshanas. Darshanas are the ones which allow us to see the world in a certain way, into reality, in the question the nature of reality. So in this epistemology, we have had a whole lot of things like Nyaya, things like yoga, things like Samkhya, Vaisheshika, Purva Mimamsa, Uttara Mimamsa. So all these schools of darshanas existed, which went into inquiry into the nature of reality. What is the nature of reality? Some of the rishis who propounded these ideas, they came about with great one-line statements like, truth exists whether we human beings know it or not. I mean, imagine what an amazing statement it is, that truth is beyond your understanding. Truth is there, whether you human beings know it or not, truth exists. And things like Vaisheshika, which worked on perception and inference, that you see it, you can measure it, and you can infer what is the behavior or the working of that entity. So these are deeply scientific ways of doing it. And others which work on reflection, consideration, and so on. See, even today, I keep saying that as a scientist, I do the same things. Whenever I'm confronted with a new problem, what do? I first want to study that problem. What is that problem all about? I go to the library, I read some journals, I see what others have said about it. I enumerate all the facts that are known about this problem. What do people know about this problem? Enumerate all of them. Then I go through a process of deep consideration, reflection, discussion with colleagues. And after a lot of thinking and writing, and I write out the models and I come up with a theory of what this is all about. So even today, we can see our knowledge systems are based on much on what the rishis have already told us. It is a similar kind of knowledge system. And then pramanas itself, the means to knowledge, that also laid out how knowledge should be accepted, because not everything is knowledge. Just because you see something doesn't make it knowledge. So there were debates on what is knowledge and what is not. For example, the Charvakas who said perception alone, only if we can perceive it, it is real. I'll reject everything else. Vedas, everything is rejected. And Buddhism, it said perception and inference alone. Only if I can perceive it and infer from it, like Vaisheshika, then that is real. Then others, they talked about experience, they talked about negative proof. For example, even the statement that in this room, there is no jar of water. So that's a negative proof. I cannot see a jar of water, so I can't perceive it. But that non-negativeness is also a true statement. Things of that nature. So the philosophical discussions into what is the nature of truth was deeply developed in India by various rishis, acharyas, gurus, and so on, and come to us via various mechanisms. So with this epistemology, we have a whole lot of knowledge developed in the Vedangas, whether you're talking about medicine, mathematics, astronomy, law, whether you're talking about artisan knowledge systems, everything is an outgrowth of this epistemology that we see. So we have seen, for example, you asked, what are the knowledge systems? After we talk about epistemology, the next thing we see is what are the works? What are the works that have come out? In addition to all these rishis' works that talk about darshanas and philosophical discussions in Upanishads and other works, we are now seeing, for example, medicine. If you take a look at Shushruta Samhita, if you look at Charaka Samhita, Vagbhata's works, and so many other people's works, we know medicine was enormously developed in India. In fact, if you take a look, there are philosophers who have said that it is the Samkhya tradition that led to much of these knowledge systems. In addition to the fact that, in addition to the fact that logical statements, the Nyaya, Samkhya, they said that it is because of medicine. Medicine was a killer application. If you want to find out whether somebody has got a certain condition, you go through some logical questions. Could it be this? Could it be that? Did this cause that? Did that cause this? This kind of a logical inquiry, the killer application was medicine. It is because of that many of these things came in Ayurveda and other works. So medicine is one big area with Ayurveda and the works that we have. Mathematics. Mathematics is an enormous field, well developed in India. For the longest time, we see this developed in India for a number of reasons. The reasons we see in the works of perhaps unlikely works of Angus Madison or Will Durant or Utsa Patnaik, who in recent times said that India was a very rich society going back to the ancient past. And if you think of commerce and trade, one has got to think about economics, one has got to think about mathematics. If a society was not adept at mathematics, algebra, positioning of economic problems in algebra form and solving these things, then you're not going to succeed in the business world. Forget it, everybody's going to cheat you. So the killer application was obviously commerce. That is a rich society that traded with everybody. And we are seeing evidence of this again and again. I've seen it in various places. So mathematics, we see the tradition. We can go all the way back to Bodhayana Sulba Sutras, or even earlier. There is evidence of several issues that you find: archaeological evidence, as well as scriptural evidence, manuscript evidence, Bakshali manuscript. We are seeing that, and so on. So algebra, geometry, trigonometry, many of these things, including all the way up to calculus, we know has been developed in India. If you go from that to astronomy, astronomy was super developed in India. In the old days, you can think that there's no television or other things to keep people occupied. So after having a dinner in the evening, the best thing you could do was, in the hot Indian summer nights, you'd come out, put your cot and lie down outside and see the stars over your head. That was an entertainment. And after some time, there's so much familiarity with the skies. It's like old friends, right? So they observed certain stars come at certain times in the night and certain times in the yearly cycle. So ancient Indians had observed the Uttarayana phenomenon, the Dakshinayana phenomenon, where the sun goes to the northernmost point and goes to the southernmost point, and observed that they could estimate the solar year on the basis of this. They could estimate it exactly at 365.24 days. They had estimated also the so-called sidereal month and the synodic month. These were lunar cycles, where the moon comes back to the same background of stars or nakshatras. That is a sidereal month. Or the moon comes back to the same phase, from new moon to new moon or full moon to full moon. That's a synodic month. And the Indians had discovered these things. They had proposed the nakshatra model, the division of the sky, ecliptic, into 27 segments, 13 and 1/3 degrees each. And they identified principal brightest stars in each of the segments, gave the names of the wives of the moons for the nakshatras. And using that, they were able to mark the passage of time. So given all these developments, we are seeing that astronomy gave rise to enormous intellectual discoveries. People wanted to reconcile the lunar cycles along with the solar cycles. And in doing so, they developed the Yuga model. Several Yuga models were developed. And by the time we come to Aryabhatta, and much before him also, actually, we had Siddhantic astronomy. Siddhantic astronomy means mathematical astronomy. That tradition was also very, very well developed, as we can see, going all the way to Kerala School of Mathematics. We are seeing a continuous, unbroken tradition in the knowledge systems of India. So I've only pointed out a few, but there is great evidence. Whichever field you take, Divyanshi, we can show that there are some ancient works that address this knowledge system. That is the bottom line.
Wow, that is in fact such a factually accurate statement, and yet it's so mind-boggling because, truthfully, sir, for anybody to acquaint himself or herself with these aspects of knowledge for the first time about his or her own civilization is so fascinating because, as I had said earlier, these complete branches of knowledge was so well concealed from the common public in order to manipulate us and in order to present us with a history that wasn't in any way correspondent to reality or correspondent to the truth. So it is, in fact, very extremely, I would say, impactful to know about these things for the first time. And definitely it would be if we were to study them in much greater detail. So A very interesting question that people often think of regarding Indian Indic epistemology and Indic science with
Mhm,
relation to the global scenario is
mhm,
how Indian fields of knowledge or Indian schools of knowledge have influenced have influenced other civilizations and other aspects of global culture. So, could you please shed some light on that?
Sure, yes, yes. So this is one of the deeply contentious areas. Ever since Max Muller and others have discounted Indian works, saying these are unreliable, there's a tendency by even present day Indian scholars, some of them in the leftist camp and so on, to deride all the Indian works as mythology or
Mhm.
unreliable and these things, and they never studied these works. So they are now tied to a different model. What is a different model? Once they've accepted these chains in their mind, that say 1500 BCE is when the so-called Aryans came to India. And by the way, they destroyed a superior culture, which was a civilization. And these pastoral nomadic people who didn't even have a script, these people, uncivilized people, lived in India after destroying that. When from 1500 BCE all the way to Magadha, the claim is there was no civilization in India. So it was Magadha's contact with the Greeks that brought back civilization to India. It is after that we see Ashoka's writings and other such rubbish. So this is the kind of narration that's taken root. So if this is a story, then the story is how can India have knowledge? Because the Harappas are an isolate. We don't know their language. We don't know what they ate, what they worship. This is the story even to the present day. They are an isolate. They were looking mostly to Sumeria and other places, not towards India. They were an isolate civilization. And Indians were uncivilized, like I said, till Magadha contact, which is 300 BC and so on. How can you have developed mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and all these fields? It's impossible. So the theory came that they must have studied from the Greeks. The Greeks and the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Chinese, all this is what brought knowledge to India. So Indians have been great students for the longest time, but we had nothing to teach the world. This is a story that is there in the textbooks even today. Unfortunately, it is utterly bogus if you start removing these constraints. Remove the constraint of Aryan invasion theory, examine the internal evidence for what it is, whether it is hydrology, whether it is astronomy, whether it is archaeology, and start examining the deep antiquity of the Indian civilization. Start looking at the knowledge systems itself. Why did they evolve? How did they evolve? And how did they cause an impact? We see great antiquity in the works. So having said that as a background, first I'll tell you just the transmission systems. If you ask about the impact on other cultures, we can go back to very ancient periods of time and question certain things. We can question why is it that in the Egyptian tradition, we do not see evidence of medicine until the Smith papyrus or the Ebers papyrus or the Cajon papyrus, all of which can be dated around 1500 BCE, 1600 BCE, and so on. Only those are showing medical knowledge, not prior to that. You go to the Mitannis or the Kessites or the Nippur archives of medical letters and so on. Everywhere we are seeing the same thing. Medical knowledge has come here only around 1500 BCE or 1600 BCE and not earlier. Whereas in India, I've shown in one of my talks where Shushruta Samhita, using the methods of Rudolf Horner, who was a bone specialist who studied how old can Shushruta Samhita be, he dated Shushruta Samhita to 600 BCE. I used his methods and said that if Shatapatha Brahmana is talking about Kritika in 3000 BCE, using the same methodology that Rudolf Horner did, I was showing that Shushruta Samhita must also be dated around 3000 BCE timeframe. We know that there were migrations from India around 2000 BCE when India experienced a 100-year monsoon failure. That monsoon failure with the drying up of Saraswati led to outward migrations. How do we know about this? We have, for example, cattle genomics. Just 2 years back, July 2019, in a paper in Science, there's a publication that said the Indian cattle called Bos indicus, this is a humped bull that we see in India, this suddenly its presence went up in the Mitanni lands, in Hittite lands, which is northern Iraq, southern Turkey, suddenly around 4,000 years ago. And by studying the genomics, they were able to propose that the multi-century drought in the Indus Valley led the people to migrate out. And their cattle is seen here. Why is the Indian cattle important? Because it is adapted to the arid conditions in India. Very valuable compared to European species that are not adapted to arid conditions. When the climate changes, becomes arid, this is the cattle that is going to give you wealth. Cattle was the wealth of the ancient world. So we see cattle genomics. We see many other things that is talking about migrations from India to this part of the world, which is also part of what Shrikant Talagiri's models are, incidentally, and the kind of models that Conrad Hills is also saying. All of these things are talking about radiating out from India. This is the model that has been discussed by several serious researchers today. If this is the case, then we can indeed see that Indians also took their knowledge systems, which could mean knowledge of astronomy, knowledge of medicine. Suddenly you're seeing in Egyptian lands, Mitanni lands, Hittite lands, Indian knowledge systems coming up over there. So this is one. I've discussed this in my talk on antiquity of Indian medical systems. I discussed in greater detail. And going to the next time frame, from 3000 BC to around this time frame, we can see this is one route for knowledge transfer. Second route for knowledge transfer is the post-Alexander time frame. From 300 BC onwards, remember that we had a consolidated empire in India, and the Greeks were pushed all the way from Persia, the Seleucid Empire, up to the Mediterranean lands. So this formed a conduit for knowledge transfer between the Seleucid Empire and India. So this is one route for knowledge transfer. Third route for knowledge transfer, the Silk Route. The Silk Route was an informal trading network all the way from Southeast Asia, through China, through India, through Central Asian lands, up to Mediterranean lands. And they were trading in a whole lot of things. I have talked about this in relation to the Bakshali manuscript and other things. There's a lot of incidents there. On the trading route was found the so-called Boer manuscript. Boer manuscript is the oldest existing manuscript we have of Indian medical systems. It is a birch bark document in Gupta Prakrit script that has got the Bela Samhita, Charaka Samhita, mentions several rishis. And where was this document found? It was found in Xinjiang province in 1800s and given to a British officer called Boer. That's why it's called Boer manuscript. And the fact that Indian manuscripts, medical manuscripts are found in the Silk Route tells me that Indian knowledge also went all over the place in the Silk Route. And we also have evidence of these Buddhist transmissions to China, to Southeast Asia, as well as this part of the world. We also have knowledge about in the Christian world after the Roman, before that, the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire, through the trading that they had, the so-called Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. This is a port sailor's document that says where in India were all the ports to trade in. So from maybe 100 BCE all the way to maybe 300 current era, enormous trading was happening between India and the Roman Empire. And this also formed a conduit for knowledge transmissions through the maritime route. Then you have the Constantine Christianity, followed by Theodosius, followed by the Byzantine kingdom, which is Christian in nature. And they had several inquisitions and issues among themselves, which led to the Nestorians, who were a certain sect of Christianity, being persecuted in the Byzantine kingdom. So they fled from there to Jundishapur. They fled from there to India, also landed up in Kerala and became the Syrian Christians around 400 current era, 600 current era. Thomas Kanna was one of the persons, and so on. Several of these merchants. So these people continued to have contacts with Edessa, the bishop in Syria and other such places. And Indian knowledge is transferred from here to there. And we have got evidence of that also through the writings of some Syrian bishops in the 7th century. We know Indian knowledge is transmitted there also. Then going to travelers. Before that, talk about the Muslim period, all the way from when Sindh fell to Bin Qasim, the 7th and 711 or so. They also took several Indian pundits, forcibly kidnapped them, took them to Baghdad, and they were converted and made to translate the works. What works were translated? Works like Charaka Samhita, Shushita Samhita, Brahmagupta's works on mathematics, astronomy. All these things were translated into Arabic and Persian. and they were injected into the Umayyad and the Abbasid Empire, which ranged all the way from Sindh to Iran area, to Arabia area, all the way to Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, all the way to Tunisia, up to Spain, southern Spain. Southern Spain, Cordoba was a capital. Northern Spain was Christian, and Toledo was the capital. In northern Spain, there were Christian monasteries whose only job was to translate Arabic works into Latin. All the way from 10th century, 11th century, 12th century, 13th century, they were translating these works. On the Muslim side, you had Baghdad House of Wisdom and places like that, consolidating Indian knowledge, forcibly got Indian knowledge, was consolidated over there, along with Greek knowledge, translated into Arabic. On that side, translated into Arabic, into Latin, injected into Europe. And pretty soon after Spain had reconquered all of Spain for Christianity, that was followed by Inquisition. That soon led to the age of Reformation and the so-called Renaissance of the European thought. That led to a regurgitation of Indian knowledge as if it is European knowledge without citations, because the church still had its control over what people could cite. They could not use Muslim sources for these works of Satan. Then we have colonialists. The colonialists who came to India directly and took knowledge and went over there. We know this enormous knowledge, whether it's a French, whether it is a British, whether it is a Dutch. We know the works they took. For example, Dutch, there is a person called Bartholomew Ziegenbalg. He came to Tranquebar and he took several Tamil books which were translated into their works, containing enormous knowledge. We know with the French, who have the largest collection of Shaiva Siddhanta manuals in French Institute of Pondicherry. We know with the British, who took enormous knowledge in various areas to their own systems. So Divyanshi, I think this is like a 2 or 3 hour talk on knowledge transmission. I'm sorry that I've taken so much time in saying that, but whatever period of time you take, I will show you a transmission mechanism in which knowledge transferred from India to certain part of the world, ancient world, medieval world, and the near modern world. And I'll show you the impact it has had. So there is a lot to say on this. That is the bottom line.
Yes, sir. And clearly there's infinite amounts to speak on this, but thank you so much for summarizing it so well, because for somebody who is not completely in depth with this explanation was absolutely perfect, because it gives a wholesome encapsulation of the entire transmission of knowledge that had taken place during the medieval and ancient times. So it's really wonderful the way you explained it. So, sir, my next question to you is, you have also spoken about how the question of Indian identity in the 21st century is a very skeptical one, is a very problematic notion that we generally approach. So, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay. So yes, so we see that there's been an evolution of identity in India. So when we go back to the most ancient times and ask what was identity, clearly there was no regional, we are Indians kind of an identity. The identity in the earliest times is that about Brahman, we are one. We are our identity. We seek truth. This is a truth-seeking civilization. What is the nature of reality? What is the reality of my existence? What is the goal of life? These are the quests and identity that most people had. Eventually, with the Pramanas, we talked about Charvakas and others. So there were people who were, you can say, Astika, Nastika kind of identities evolved, where people with certain Pramanas, they questioned certain things and rejected Shabda Pramana, rejected certain things. So this was the identity that evolved again in very ancient times. And there were debates on where people fall, this or that. There's no clear distinction saying you are this, you are that. These are 20th century categorizations. That led much later, when the Muslims and the Arab and the Abrahamic religions, they came about, we became the other. We became the other because we were everything they were not. So they came about with this notion of monotheism. This monotheism concept goes back at a very ancient time, if you go to Babylon, if you go to if you go to Persia, at that time when the Semitic people were living with these people, around that time, these notions of monotheism came about from a bedrock of polytheism that existed at that time.
Mhm.
I'm using modern words. These
Yeah.
are not truly applicable in the Indian context, but still, let's use this. So monotheism came about in the context of why monotheists if there are already so many divinities or the nature of divinity was seen. So it came about with, I am better than everybody else. They're all false, I am better. So this kind of exclusivity came to give credibility, what we call pramana. What is your authority for knowledge? Are you using Shabda Pramana? Are you using logic? Are you using rationality? What are you using in order to claim this divinity status and other such things? So in this case, it was nothing more than I said so. I have a revelation from God, or some prophet, he came and talked to me, or he talked to God, and therefore he said that, therefore it is true. Or there is some supernatural incident that has happened, and he rose from the dead, and all these kind of things. And that is why this is true. So these kind of illogical, irrational statements coated with a lot of anger in terms of us and them kind of dynamics that came about from Abrahamic times. And we are seeing evidence of these things in the Old Testament itself. If you go to the Old Testament, we are seeing many of the battles that the Yahweh God commanded the Semitic people, Hebrew people, were against the Vedic people. Were against
Yes.
the people, the Canaanites, the Hittites, and the Jebusites, and other such people are living. We even identified Mitannis as one of the people that these biblical people are fighting with. And we are seeing the turning away from Vedantic ideas in the Old Testament, in the Genesis and other accounts itself. If you read the account of Genesis, it is trying to say God created a perfect Eden for Adam and Eve. First Adam, then out of Adam's Eve, in an inferior way, he makes Eve, and then tells them you can do everything except eat of the tree of wisdom. Wisdom, mind you.
Ah.
And the snake comes and says, do you know if you eat of the tree of wisdom, you'll realize you're as powerful as God. So this is a Vedantic idea where we are
Mm.
all Brahman, and we
Yeah.
realize that through self-realization and knowledge, that this is the inward journey we go about to realize the nature, our true nature. So this is rejected in the Genesis story where the snake comes and tempts Eve. Eve goes, eats this, gets some viveka of discrimination, and she puts on some clothes or bark or fig leaf or whatever. God comes and asks, why are you two hiding over there? And he realizes they have disobeyed him. And the curse, the
Ah.
fall of man, humanity starts over there. And the original sin starts over there. And a whole lot of problems start over there in that tradition. So we are seeing that the rejection of Vedanta is there in the Genesis, earliest Abrahamic accounts. It starts a turning away. There are several other stories I can tell you that show where this rejection starts. Anyway, that us and them was violent. That us and them monotheism became very violent. So they came to India, who, when we start with biblical people, let's leave that. That all happened outside India. That is fine. In northern Iraq, southern. So the Vedic domain shrunk gradually from that very great domain into, perhaps you can think, Afghanistan, India. This is where it was restricted. But by the time the Islamic people came, we became the kafir. We became the mushrik. We became the idolaters. We became the hated people who had to be killed, destroyed, and those kinds of things. And they became the other. That was our identity. We didn't ask for that identity. It was
Mhm.
forced on us by them. Then going on to the Christian times, the colonialists. So again, we became the other. We became the pagan. We became the
Mhm.
heathen. We became the casteist. We became the Aryan. We became the Dravidian. We became all of these identities which the Europeans thrust on us. We
Yeah.
didn't ask for that. This was thrust on us by them. European colonialism came along with ethnocide. Enormous ethnocide also came. I talked about 5 frameworks that is controlling your mind on history, on what your
Yeah.
history and identity is. But that came hand in hand with the British ethnocide also. Ethnocide, we had 5 mechanisms basically. So they controlled not only, first of all, poverty. I talked about this. India was a very rich society in the past. In British times, we fell. The curve went steeply from approximately 25% of world GDP. We went to less than 4% of world GDP through a sequence of events, not only impoverishment by high taxation, but prevention of Indians from participating in the Industrial Revolution. Industrialization was forbidden to Indians. India was made a captive market for finished goods from Europe. All these things led unfair trade practice and everything, poverty. We know that. So poverty had the greatest effect of ethnocide, the transformation of a people itself. Second was this conception of caste. This
Mm.
conception of caste was something that Risley and other anthropologists, they came about. They force-fed their notion of caste on the Jati Varna system that served the Indian model for a very, very long time. And that caused enormous distortions going hand in hand with this. Third was the missionaries, the Christianization. Christianization led to a destruction of religion in India. All over, they went about on the war path by trying to show India's backward, primitive, Hinduism is the work of Satan, and all these kind of works which controlled people's minds. So this way, with many mechanisms, the other one was the introduction of English. So the introduction of English was the English Education Act. That saw the creation of a class of elites in India, in Bengal especially, and other places, people who looked down upon the vernacular, people who looked down upon the classical languages of India, and they held up the Western model of progress and so on. So this is the model. So the introduction of English led to a distancing of Indians further from their past. Works in Sanskrit and Arabic were not funded by the British. Only works in English were to be promoted in printing and other such things. The schools that were formed, the jobs that you would get, everything was geared towards English only. So we had several mechanisms of ethnocide that also had an impact on identity. Excuse me when I reject this call. So like I said, the 5 frameworks that control your mind in history and these frameworks of ethnocide that I talked about, all of this has led to deep deracination. Deracination is when the Indian today has got no clue of who he is. You ask the average
Mhm.
person on the road, what are you? Scratch it. I'm an Indian. I'm an Indian, and I like cricket and I like Bollywood and I salute the flag. That is about it. Nobody can connect to their past. Nobody can say, I am the proud inheritor of this glorious civilization that existed, this knowledge system that existed, because everything has been perverted. People have been kept in a state of ignorance. The ignorance has been forced by these 5 frameworks, continued today by the Modi administration in addition, who's not done a single thing to remove this framework. So we are seeing a continuation of these policies into present day, keeping Indians in a state of blissful ignorance, deracinated, removed from their context, and in awe of the Western civilization, chasing a Western model and accelerating downfall of the Indian model. And the bottom line is today we are seeing the conflict model that has been proposed by the leftists and the Marxists that has been upheld. Everywhere you go, you see the students who are completely ignorant of the ancient Indian models have readily adopted this conflict model. This conflict model is emphasizing a bottom-up narration where everybody is in conflict with everybody else. Why is that? Because that is a Marxist model. Marxist model believes that all of history is a history of class conflicts.
Yes.
The only
Yes.
history that exists is class conflict. That's according to them. And to them, they believe in this utopian fantasy of a classless society, which can come about by the destruction of the old order. And in the West, the old order is whatever they want, the capitalist class and whatever. In India, it is Hinduism. By destroying Hinduism, they believe they can get this classless society, whatever that might mean. So this model has been adopted by the socialists, also the Nehruvian socialists who have upheld this, and this is what is happening. So the conflict model, the so-called subaltern voices that is coming, that is trying to say that here is this person's story, that person's story, and these little stories are amplified as reality.
Yes.
The top-down model is gone. The top-down model is a cohesive identity. The top-down model talks about the Indian civilization, the idealization, the practicalities, what it is, the evidence that we have, the texts that we have, the philosophies that we have, the gurus, acharyas that we have who have told us these many things, the scientists that we have had. It is the top-down model is cohesive, shows the enormous cultural unity and identity of the Indian civilization. The bottom-up model that has been pushed today is a conflict model, us and them, oppressor oppressed, that is only looking at that person marginalize this person, that person's ancestor, put down these people, you're retrogressive, you belong to the cancel culture, you need to be put down. So this is the kind of noise is amplified. Enormous noise is amplified without the ability to rationally, logically deconstruct any of these bottom-up claims. That is what
Yes.
is happening today. So the identity is a massive casualty over here. It's a casualty of these kind of dynamics. So today, what is the situation that you have? Today, the average Indian, his sacred spaces are under attack. His sacred spaces are not holy anymore. They are all perverted. They're all attacked. His identity is attacked. If you were to wear any identity of a Hindu, you're under attack. Your festivals are under attack. Your beliefs are under attack. Your food is under attack. Every single aspect of your existence, history, everything is under attack by these frameworks, these 5 frameworks that have led to deracination, that have led to this kind of an amplification of the leftist voice, that has led to this kind of a situation. So in the noise that we are seeing today, the identity issue has got completely submerged into this miasma, very, very pungent odor of this leftism that is coming over here, where we are completely lost sight of who we are as a people. This is the tragedy of where we are. So much so that even last year, the CEO of a major company, founder of a major company in India, he came on Times of India in an interview saying, Hinduism is the reason for our backwardness. This was a major industry leader who formed a massive software company in India that is well known even today. This man, who is a known Marxist, comes out with a statement like this saying, Hinduism is the reason we are not progressed for the last 3,000 years. So in his thinking, jettison Hinduism for progress. So when thought leaders like this, I hesitate to call him thought leader,
Exactly.
business leader, his accomplishment is
Hmm.
in business.
Hmm.
Business leaders come and state these kind of things. A lot of unthinking youngsters might be swayed by this kind of thinking. So we have
Yes.
this unfortunate situation where the people who can guide the acharyas, the gurus, and others are they're not fully aware of some of these battlefronts over there. Some thought leaders like Rajiv Malhotra and others have written excellent books and given talks that help us to place some of these conflicts in their place and understand what is going on. But there is great need for the younger generations to understand some of these frameworks, battles on identity, try to deconstruct these claims, and try to show the utter hollowness of these things and where our civilization comes from. The sad reality is the coolness factor is not there.
Mm-hmm.
So the old is seen as retrogressive and the coolness factor is not there. So how do you get the coolness factor? How do you try to show pride in your civilization? How did the Chinese do it? How did the Japanese do it? How did the French
Yes.
do it? How did these people, these civilizations don't even have a fraction of what our ancestors have, but they have glorious narratives of their civilization. The average person has got enormous pride in who they are, who their ancestors were. How do we get that into India? That's something that most of us have to sit and think about. And I think the solution is for people to realize they are deracinated, break these chains, these shackles that have been put in your mind, break them and get out of it with logic, with rationality, with evidence, and
Yes.
try to see what is our true narration. So this is my take on the identity, Divyanshi.
Yes, sir. And thank you so much for so wonderfully explaining the problems that we face because, honestly, I could relate to every single thing you say. I mean, coming from, as I said, I'm going to pass out of school this year, so I'll be joining college this year itself. And the points that you made about how the current generation is swayed away by these nonsensical leftist philosophies. I have witnessed them firsthand. And the kind of excommunication, it's like they're emulating the Catholic Church. So, like you said, sir, the church used to simply excommunicate people who used to say anything contradictory to them, who used to disobey them. Similarly, these people will ensure that any contrarian view gets muffled out to its complete extent, and that's what they try to do in these education institutions. Any voice of dissent, especially when it's compiled with reason and evidence, is simply not given its due importance. It's not given its due traction that it deserves. So
Right.
definitely, so everything that you said, I mean, you're an ocean of knowledge, to be really honest. I mean, it's really should I say it's it's like I'm speaking to the it's like Goddess Saraswati has
Oh
blessed
my
me.
goodness, please
I
don't.
mean, no,
And
sir,
no is there.
really. I'll say this and I'll just quickly wrap up so that we can. I really want to interact a little with you, but I'll just give the ending part of this interview. So thank you so much, sir, for joining us. It was on our platform. We are truly honored to have you here with us. It was an absolute blessing for us to host you on our show, and the impeccable knowledge that you have shared with us is simply inestimable. It's simply invaluable. So, dhanyawad, Rajji. Pranam for joining us on our
Thank
show.
you. Thank you so much, Divyanshi, for inviting me to the show. And in closing, I'll just request people watching this, the students watching this, please, there are a lot of thought leaders over there, a lot of thought leaders, and read their works, try to see their videos, try to read their books and others. I named a few of them. I'll again mention there's people like Professor Michel Danino, Professor Subhash Kak, there is Rajiv Malhotra, there is Conrad Elst, there are several people that you can, Srikant Talagiri and others. Read their works, try to understand where the narrations are, and there's a lot you can do to enrich yourself and your identity of who you are. So once again, thank you very much for inviting me.
धन्यवाद सर.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Citti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.